from Ian about how to create and interpret task protocols. So this is sort of the next level. So what we're going to do here is go through a bunch of the general concepts of custom task programming. If you're not familiar with MATLAB, we've got, and Simulink in particular, our user guides have lots of good information in them about where you should go to look at these topics. In particular, MATLAB and Simulink have some great tutorials that they have available on their websites already. We're going to go through everything that I'm going to go through here is covered in our task programming guide. So it can all be referenced in there. Those are always, we always drop those on the Dexterity computers when we install things, and you can certainly find them on our support website if you haven't already gone to our support website. And yeah, there's lots of great examples and further details of things you can look at in those guides and on our support site. So especially for the examples, we've got loads of them on the support website. So if you have a question for a common experimental paradigm, chances are we already have something that's available as an example for you to start from. So how do these task protocols and task programs relate to one another? So as Ian talked about, the task program is where you're going to implement your logic, the experimental paradigm. Is it a reaching experiment? Is it a bimanual control experiment? Those sorts of things. So your task program, which is what this talk is about, that's where you're going to, your task paradigm is done in the task program. And the task protocol is just all about filling in the free parameters. So when you make your task program, you don't say, I'd like a target to show up on the screen here. You just say, I'd like a target to show up, and then it's up to the task protocol to tell us where that target's going to be, what color it is, what size it is, that sort of thing. So the program is the general logic, the protocol is the specifics. Okay. So we're going to work through a bit of an example as we go through this talk, and this is the example program we're going to do. So during each trial, a target turns on. Once the subject reaches to that target, the target moves to a new location, and once the subject reaches the new location, the target turns off and the trial is over. So fairly straightforward example of a reaching task is what we're gonna go through as work through as an example. So when you want to actually make use of a task program, you're going to go to your custom tasks tab, and in your custom tasks tab, you're going to see something that looks very much like this. So this will be your task program, and under it, you'll have a series of task protocols. And what we do from a dexterity side is you select your task protocol, we take the task program, push it to the robot computer, and then we take your task protocol and push it into the task program. And then it's up to the robot computer to actually run everything. In terms of how the task development runs, you can have a third computer that contains MATLAB and all of the required libraries that, or you can do that on the dexterity computer. We don't encourage people to put a whole lot extra on the dexterity computer because it can have some negative effects. But in terms of MATLAB, that is one thing we will allow you to, we do say is okay to be on the dexterity computer. Sort of up to you, up to your lab, which is the most convenient way to run. Some labs that have a very high usage of their Kinarms, you'd need another computer where you would do some of your task development. So one of the first things you're going to need to learn in order to run a task program is Simulink. Simulink is a library that MATLAB provides. It's a graphical language and a very, very high level tool for helping you visualize data flow. Everything in it is hierarchical. So every block that you see is going to have things that go on underneath it. And you have the ability to look inside these blocks and see what they do. You can just right click and say look under block, and you can see all of the code that we write in order to make the Kinarm work. If you're more comfortable working in a MATLAB environment, you always have that option. You can put in what's called an embedded MATLAB block. So this is just a special type of block that allows you to write some MATLAB code in it in order to do whatever extra things you need to do within your robot. So if you need some extra calculations that are a little more complex, you can do them within one of these embedded MATLAB blocks. Not all MATLAB is something, or not all standard MATLAB is something that can be run on the robot computer, but you'll get compiling errors if you write something that it's unhappy converting. And the last thing that's really important for Simulink and for our environment in particular is this integration with Stateflow. So using Stateflow and Simulink together is an important way of how you would program tasks for the Kinarm. So within Simulink, everything executes at 4 kilohertz. So one clock cycle, one real-time clock cycle is a 0.25 millisecond slice of time. So you can think that basically your task is doing everything it needs to every 0.25 milliseconds. What I mean by that is your execution is always going to start at a source. So a source is any block that only has arrows going out of it. So you can see these blocks only have arrows leaving them, nothing going in, so those are considered a source. The data flows along the arrows and always ends at a sink. And a sink is a block that just has arrows going into it, nothing coming out. Something important to note though is because as I mentioned before, these blocks are all hierarchical. Internally, each block can have any number of sources and sinks as well. Luckily, you don't need to worry about that in particular, unless you do something strange. The compiler and the Stateflow and Simulink environments just sort of figure it out for you and make the data flow happen appropriately. So when you want to add blocks to your task to do something interesting, you're going to start at the library browser. That's this little button up here. You click the library browser, and that's going to open up the Simulink library. Once you've installed our task development kit, or the TDK, you'll get these extra things will show up within your library browser, so you can grab these blocks and drag them and drop them into a model. So this is an example of the most basic task you can create. These are the absolutely required Simulink blocks that we need in order for your task to be a Kinarm task. So the ones we have here that are important, we have GUI control. Not much that you do with this block in particular. This is mainly for us to interact with in order to do things like randomize your trials and start new trials and that sort of thing. But the data logging block does kind of what the name suggests. It's all about logging all of the data, getting all the kinematics from the system and any extra data that you'd like output, packaging it all together and sending it across to Dexterity to actually be saved. So again, not a huge amount you directly do to interact with this, but there are a couple of extra options you can find in there. The one you do interact with quite a bit as a task programmer is this parameter table definition block. We'll go through some of the stuff you do with that, but Ian was mentioning that the task programmer has a lot of control over what shows up for certain tables. So like your TP table, your trial protocol table, you have control over what columns are available for someone to edit in that table, and this is the block that is used to define what all those tables are. And then last is this trial control block. So this is actually a stateflow block. So this is where you kind of formalize your experiment. This is the logic flow of your experiment would be done in this trial control block. There's some other blocks that are pretty common to make use of. Hand in target. It's kind of what it sounds like. It tries to let you know if you've got things defined in your target table, is your hand in any of those particular targets. Show target and process video commands. These ones are all about making sure things get put on the screen. So the process video commands is the one that actually does the heavy lifting in terms of making sure things get put on the screen. Show target helps define what those things are. So you might have several show target blocks for different targets on that you'd like shown simultaneously. And then the apply loads block. If you want your Kinarm to actually create forces or torques, you'll need an apply loads block that's appropriate to your Kinarm. So there's ones for different types of Kinarms, the exoskeleton versus endpoint, and there's lots of different blocks to actually create the different sorts of load conditions. We'll go over those in detail. We'll go over all of these in more detail in other talks, but these are common ones that you'll regularly see. So we've mentioned a bit of Simulink. Now Stateflow is the other important MATLAB toolbox that we make use of. So Stateflow is a tool for graphically making finite state machines. That's a programming term, computer science term for basically a flowchart. And all of these flowcharts, all of these state flow diagrams have some similar features. They have these states, and they have transitions. This state machine architecture is really good for formalizing how your experiment actually flows. So you can think of it very much like a flowchart you would make on just with pen and paper that just describes, I'd like my experiment to do this thing, and then when this happens, I want this next thing to happen. So just describe the flow of the way your experiment goes. Now, the state flow works a bit differently than Simulink. So there's some formal terminology that MATLAB uses. I'll try and kind of stick close-ish to that because it's that way when you look things up, it's easier. The execution of a state flow chart means that you're in a state and you look for valid transitions out of that state. So at any given time as the program is running, there may be valid transitions, there may not. So in this example, we see if this particular chart is going to start in this first state where we're saying the target is in state 1, so we're turning a target on. Someone's able to, so now we've turned a target on, someone's able to see it. It's visible to them. And now we're going to just wait around in this state until this transition is valid. So when the hand is in the target, hand in target equals 1. So this is, as this chart is executing, every millisecond, it's going to be saying, oh, is the hand in the target? Nope, I'm staying here. Is the hand yet in the target? Nope, I'm staying here. Ah, the hand is now in the target. I'm allowed to transition. And so the first, as soon as this condition is found to be true, this transition is taken, and then this code is executed. So in this case, we're turning the target off. Does that make sense to everyone, hopefully? All right. Since I can't see your faces, I'll if you want to raise your hand, or if you're having trouble, definitely let me know. So stateflow executions a little bit is Yeah, it's got some tricks to it. So the state flow charts will execute anytime there is what's called an input event. Um, so you can have one or more input events during any Simulink time frame, meaning every 0.25 milliseconds, every quarter of a millisecond, your chart might not execute, or it might execute several times. Depends on how many input events there have been. If there's no input events, then nothing happens. The chart doesn't wake up and the chart doesn't do anything. It doesn't check anything. At the very least, Dexterity provides a 1 kilohertz clock input to your state flow chart, meaning that every millisecond, at the very minimum, your task is going to wake up and check all of the available, or check for state change possibilities. So it might happen more than that, but you're guaranteed that it will happen at least at every millisecond. So Stateflow versus Simulink. Everything in your Simulink chart is constantly running. You know, every quarter millisecond, all of the blocks you see run all of their code. Whereas with Stateflow, you're in a state, and every millisecond or more, depending on how many input events there are, it will wake up, look for transitions, and potentially take a transition or not. So Simulink, everything's going all the time. Stateflow, you're in one state looking for ways out of that state. Again, it's typically your Simulink is going to be always all running, so all of your blocks are doing everything they need. Stateflow, no, you're in a state, you're looking for transitions. So how do you go about developing a task for Kinarm? Well, first of all, you want to go through and think about what you want to happen. And as you're thinking about it, probably a good way to go is going to be create a flow chart of the way you think your task should proceed. Once you've got that flow chart, convert it to Stateflow. You're going to add a whole bunch of Simulink blocks to make things happen, and then lots of debugging and verification. So we'll give you as many hints as we can over the course of the next few days to kind of guide you through good ways to make this process work as smoothly as possible for you on a Kinarm. As many hints as we've all picked up over the years for making this process efficient and hopefully not terribly error prone. Okay, so back to our initial example. So we're going to go through the code that does this particular task. So a target will turn on, the subject will reach to a target, the target moves to a new location, subject reaches to the new location, and the trial's done. That's it. So the code in order to make this happen is this. So at a Simulink level, this is all of the code you would need. So from a Simulink standpoint, you can see we've got our standard blocks, the GUI control, data logging, and then trial control, parameter table definition. But as well, we've got some of these common ones like showing a target, process video command, hand in target, and even hand feedback. So the hand feedback is for showing where the subject's hand is. Okay, so the Simulink side of that is relatively straightforward. There's not a lot going on there. Where there's things going on is going to be in the state flow. So we'll kind of build up the state flow as we go so you can see where it all comes from. So we've obviously started here and we've created our flowchart idea where we have a state where we're turning on a target, transition where we're waiting for the target, waiting for the subject to reach into that target. Another state that says, okay, subject has reached. Now we're going to move the target and to a new location. We're going to wait again until the subject's hand is in the target, and then the trial's over. So That's the basic flow. In order to make this work within the kind of Kinarm context, we need to add a few extra things. First extra thing we need to add is this between trials state. So you can see this ends up making a loop, and that's important because if you've got more than one trial you want to run, we need a way to get back into the first state. So you will run through to one trial, and then basically this allows us to flip through and say, oh no, now we're starting the next trial, and now we're starting the next trial. So we need that looping structure in there. An extra thing that's pretty common to put in and very useful. Well, we always need to know that this is a state flow requirement. You need a transition coming in from nothing. That tells Stateflow where to actually start and work from. And it's often common to have an initialization state where you're going to go through and make sure all of your targets are turned off and that your forces are off and that sort of thing. It's basically just set up things before your task actually begins. And something else that's useful here, you can see we still have our transition here that says wait until the hand is in the target. We've added an extra transition that says wait for a specified period of time. One of the things that is useful to do when you're building your tasks is to create timeouts. So sometimes, maybe especially if you're working with people that have some sort of pathology, maybe they can't reach to a location. So you don't want your task basically to stop and have no data, stop and need to kill the task. You want it to keep running, so you'd add a timeout, and that allows you to finish the trial and then move on to do another trial that maybe your subject can complete. So looking for places that you can put in timeouts is really important. Okay, so we've got the setup here basically, and now we're going to fill it in with some code. Now there's lots of code here. We're going to go through the bits and pieces of it as we look at each of the different facets of this. So there are different types of stateflow variables that you're going to make use of as you're programming. Constants and local variables are the common ones. There's it's a standard convention that we try and encourage people. If you're making constants, you should have these in uppercase. In this case, those are constants that you've defined using the parameter table block, and we'll show you kind of how that referencing works. So those are ones that you're going to define as a task programmer. It can be also very useful to create several local variables. Those are just variables that you use within the chart only. You don't need to send them out anywhere. They're just localized to within the chart you're working on. And of course, to make Stateflow useful, you need to be able to push data in and pull data out, and push data out of it. So you can see here, we have, there we go. We have these Stateflow input variables. So the input variables always come in on the left of the chart. And in this case, trial protocol is an input. So this is one that we're providing for you from the GUI control block. So this is basically an array of information about this trial. And we also have Stateflow outputs. The outputs are always on the right side. So these are variables that you will change within the chart, and then they get pushed out to be used by some other part of the system. So in this case, this is saying which target to show out of the target table. Okay. When you need to create new variables, you will use this little icon called the Model Explorer. So within the Model Explorer, there's this little icon up here that allows you to create data. So you can see these different ones here, and you can change whether they're input, output, or locals just by clicking on that within the Model Explorer. So once you've defined your variable within the Model Explorer, you're allowed to start using it within Stateflow. And this is a good point to mention that there is one thing that is often problematic uh, for the people who are used to programming in MATLAB. Everyone knows MATLAB has the first index in an array is always 1. The syntax used within the trial control block within this Stateflow is actually C based, and if you're programming in C, the first index of an array is always 0, which means that you will have mismatches between your MATLAB code and your Stateflow code unless you go in to look at your array. So this is an array. You go to the description and you can say set my first index to 1, and at that point you can use variables within Stateflow as though they are a MATLAB array, more or less. So the common way that you'll run into this is you're doing some reaching, and you reach into a target and you say, my hand is in the target, but my task isn't doing anything. It's not moving on. It's not doing what I expect it to. It's probably going to be this particular error. That's the most common way that people run into it the first time. Yeah, eventually you get used to it, but don't worry if you run into this. It's very common. We don't expect you to remember this off the top of your head because it's kind of a low-level thing. But yeah, definitely let us know. Don't, especially during this week of camp, don't sit there stuck for hours and hours. Ask one of us, and we'll probably recognize this sort of error pretty quickly. Okay, so we've talked about variables, inputs, outputs, that sort of thing. There's another type of variable you can use, and these are Stateflow events. These are more just a trigger. You can think of them. So when you're using them, you will notice that they are highlighted yellow. The syntax is highlighted yellow for you, so you know you've named it correctly. And actually, that's something I'll point out as you're doing your programming. If the highlighting and the syntax highlighting doesn't look right in your state, that's a good indication that there's something not right in the state. There's a syntax error or something like that. As soon as the syntax is right, it should highlight everything for you correctly. Now, two types of events that you'll make use of normally. These will be, so these are events that are inputs, and they come from outside the system, and they're intended to make your system do something immediately, generally. So in particular, this one is the exit trial now event. This is something that you would, it's one of our standard events. You need to put that or the handling for that within your model in order to handle the pause button. So when the subject hits the pause button, you need to handle this event in order to make your task pause properly. There are also Stateflow output events. This end trial event is sent outside of the Stateflow chart, and it's actually in particular sent to the GUI control block, and it's you need to send it to us so that we know, oh, this trial is done, and we can start a new trial or stop the task if that's appropriate. So that's an event you need to send us in order to properly have your task continue. So how do these work? These Stateflow input events, Stateflow input events always go into the top of the chart here, just by definition, and Stateflow output events are always on the bottom right. Again, just by definition, that's where Stateflow puts them. So if you want to define some events, if you need to trigger other parts of your system or interact with some of our blocks as well, you need to go again back to this Model Explorer icon. And this time the icon you want to make use of at the top here is this little lightning bolt. And that will create new events for you that can be input or output events down here. Something else that's really very useful, I mentioned that you often will want to do timeouts. So in order to handle those, there are these temporal logic operators. Uh, that is the term you need to use if you want to be able to find help on them in the in the MATLAB help. So the most common one you will find is this one here, this after event. So what that's going to do is, here we've said tick count is 1500. And then there's this eClock variable. So these temporal logic operators, they work in conjunction with these stateflow events. So what will happen here is this eClock is the 1 kilohertz input signal that we provide. So this will happen once every millisecond. So what this does in particular is, from the time we enter this upper state, we will wait until 1500 eClocks has happened, and then this transition becomes valid. So effectively, that means that this is a 1.5 second wait, or 1500 millisecond wait, before we automatically transition to the next state. So there's a few other of these operators. After is going to be probably the most useful one, but you can look up what the other what other operators are available to you. So yeah, very common, and this is the by far the easiest way to make to create a timeout of any sort in your task. Okay. Now, I mentioned before about the parameter table definition block being kind of the main block that you interact with when you're defining your task as a task programmer. So this one has a user interface to it. You double click the block, and you get something up that looks very much like this. So earlier we were showing the those constants that were in some of the stateflow blocks. Well, this is where you define those constants. Okay, so here we're looking at the TP table. So as a task programmer, you come in here and you say, well, for each of my trials, I need a start target, an end target, a maximum reach time, and a post-trial delay. So you create these different rows here, and those translate into columns that make it into your TP table. So these are used within your task program. These constants are used within the task program. Everything else here is read in by Dexterity, and it actually is what creates the user interface for when you're editing your task protocol later. So these are all the column titles that you will see when you want to edit a task protocol. And these are all of the different descriptions you can get when you click on the task protocol within Dexterity. So this is the place that you go as the task programmer to define what you want someone to give you in a task protocol. Each of these work nearly identically in terms of the target table, tab, load table. Each of those are the same. You're going to create a series of columns, give them constant names, give them labels that show up in Dexterity. Yeah, they're all very, very similar in that regard. The ones that are a little bit different are the events. Those are a little different because that doesn't actually create a table anywhere that you edit. That's just something for you as the task programmer. Speaking of events, so these Dexterity events, these Dexterity event codes, they are effectively just a way to mark a time point. So to tell you later, as you're analyzing your data, something specific happened at this time. So in this case, the example here is the target turned on. So or the subject reached the target. So these are incredibly useful because without these, there's next to no way to tell when certain types of things happened within the system without doing some kind of backflips and using heuristics to figure out when things happened. So these are incredibly useful. Without putting these event codes in, it can be next to impossible to do your analysis later. So we would always highly recommend using more event codes than less. And if you don't end up using them, that's not a big deal later, but they're incredibly useful. So, because effectively what you get later is when you're analyzing your data using MATLAB, you'll see these giant arrays of kinematics and that sort of thing, and you'll have event codes that say, at this time in the data, the target turned on, or at this time in the data, a perturbation started. So it gives you ways to say, in particular in your analysis, okay, I don't care about anything that happened before the perturbation started. So I only need to start searching for whatever's interesting to me as of this particular time point. And without these sorts of event codes, yeah, it's nearly impossible to determine those sorts of, or at least it's incredibly difficult to determine those sorts of things. As well, when you're debugging your task, so when you're first doing your programming, there's not a lot of great tools for the running, when your task is running on the robot computer, for you to tell exactly what's going on. So, in many ways, it's kind of reading tea leaves. And this is one of the tea leaves you can give yourself to read. So these event codes, you can say, well, you can start running your task and then see these events coming up in Dexterity and say, okay, well, I see the target went on, and you look at the screen. Yes, the target's on, no problem, everything's good. And then, oh, the hand is in the target. Is my next code? Yes, my hand is in the target. I understand, everything's working. And because sometimes your task can get into a different state than you expect, and now you need to figure out why it went there. And these event codes can help you see, oh, yes, I can see where I went I can see what state it went to. Let's go back and trace through the state flow and figure out why did it go to that state I didn't want it to. So while you're debugging your experiment, and then later while you're trying to analyze your data, these are incredibly useful. The next thing that's really useful is going to be what's called an SLRT scope. So this is a Simulink real-time scope. And here's a picture of one right here. These are very helpful tools that if you've not used the Kinarm before, and some people who have, you wouldn't necessarily see this, but the robot computer actually has its own display. So this is another part of reading the tea leaves, or another tool in reading the tea leaves that's very useful. So if you've got a standard Kinarm setup, it's set up with what's called a KVM switch, a keyboard video mouse, and that allows you to double tap the scroll lock key, and then it will switch the display from looking at the Dexterity computer, the Windows computer, over to looking at the screen of the robot computer. And that's where you would see these Simulink real-time scopes. It can be useful to have two monitors set up so you can actually see both at the same time, but if not, you can, like I say, double tap scroll lock, and then it'll flip over to the other monitor so you can see what's going on that computer. So these scopes allow you to display some numerical data in real time, or even it'll do some graphing for you to show different values. So very useful to help you debug and figure out, again, what might be going wrong with my program. As you can see the numbers live as they're happening, and look for different types of transitions, and yeah, whatever might be useful to help you debug your program. So very highly recommended. Okay, so you've gone through, you've programmed your task, you're ready to test it, ready to see what happens. So what are you going to do? You are going to look for this little icon called that is Build Model, or you can hit Control B. That will take a few minutes, and once your task is done building, you might get some errors happen during the compile process that you might need to deal with. Most of the errors are pretty helpful during this build process. Not all of them, but most of them are pretty helpful. If you run into an error, it could look something like this. You'll look at this diagnostic window and it'll say, undeclared identifier. So this is one of the reasons that it can be really helpful to build, even if you're not going to take your task and test it. We would recommend, make a change, do a build, make a change, do a build. Don't program for 4 hours and then try and build, because then things like this, undeclared identifier foo, it's going to be really hard to remember, where did I use that name? How did I use it? Why might that be wrong? So make some small changes, especially when you're starting out. Make some small changes, do a test build, make some small changes, do a test build, and do that iteratively. So when you do get an error, you can say, oh, that was one of the last 2 things I did, not which one of the last 40 things I did was that. Okay, so you've gone through, you've fixed all the errors in building, you've got a task program that now compiles. So what do you do with it? So the process of compiling will create a .dlm file. And that DLM file needs to be put in the right place. So that's your compiled code. We need to have access to that, or Dexterity needs to have access to that in order to actually run it. So within, let's see, so you can see here we have under My Documents, there's going to be a folder called Dexterity, and then a version number tasks. So for this week, it'll be 3.8 is the version I think everybody's making use of. So there'll be Dexterity 3.8 tasks, and under that is going to be another set of folders. So in this case, we'll have one called Basic Posture Task. Each task program needs to have its own folder. So each task program needs to have one DLM file. If you have multiple DLM files, then we just find the first one, and once we have the first one, we're done. We stop looking for more of them. So if for some reason, as you're testing, you can't find your, when you're looking in Dexterity, you keep looking and saying, I can't find my program. I put it in there. What's going wrong? Well, probably there's a second DLM file in the same folder, and we're just finding the other one. So within this task programs folder, there's going to be we need a set of files. And what are those files? Well, we need that DLM file. And the DLM, like I said, that's the compiled version of your task. That is the thing we actually interact with. That's the bit of information that we pass over to the robot computer. The next thing that's really important that we make use of, and I should also point out, let's see back here, whatever is the name of your DLM file, we actually just chop off the .dlm, and that's the name that gets put within this tree in the custom task programs, or when you're looking at the custom task program. So whatever name you have here is exactly what you'll see here. Next thing. There are these DTP files, the Dexterity Task Protocol. So these files are created by Dexterity, and they're the task protocols that actually get run with your task program. So again, same idea. Whatever name that is here, we just chop off the .dtp, and that's the name that you'll see in the tree. You can have, so as I mentioned, you'll have one DLM in a folder, but you can have many DTPs. You can have as many DTPs as you want, but you can only have a single DLM. If your task program makes use of images, so if you're trying to, if some of your targets are actually images, then we need all of those images in this folder as well. Those can be PNG, JPEG, or BMP files, just kind of the standard types of image files. And it's pretty common in here to put the .slx file, so that's the actual model. We don't use it in Dexterity, but it can be useful to keep that information all together. That way, if something happens, you can find it easily. You'll know where it is. But we don't make use of it. It's not required to be there, but common practice to put it in there.